At our rehearsal dinner, my mother-in-law raised her glass and said, "To the girl who almost lowered our family standards." Before I could speak, my fiancé's 80-year-old grandfather stood up, looked her dead in the eye, and said 3 words that made her drop her glass and sprint for the doors. The champagne glass didn't just fall from Diane's hand, it left it like she'd been electrocuted, and by the time it hit the parquet floor of the Ashgrove room, she was already 3 steps toward the exit, one heel catching on the runner, her napkin still tucked into her collar. Nobody moved to help her. 40 people sat frozen around 2 long tables, watching a 61-year-old woman in a beaded gray dress sprint for the double doors like the building was on fire, and the only sound in the room was Walton Whitfield lowering himself back into his chair, calm as a man who'd just finished ordering dessert. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't even fully stood, just enough to be seen over the centerpiece, and said 3 words, quiet enough that half the room had to lean toward their neighbor to ask what he'd said. 9 elderly investors. That was it. 3 words, and Julian's mother, chair of the Whitfield Elder Trust Foundation, the woman who had spent 4 months finding new ways to remind me I hadn't grown up the way this family had grown up, was gone before the doors stopped swinging. I sat there with my glass still raised from the toast I hadn't been allowed to finish, and I understood exactly one thing. Whatever those 3 words meant, my future grandfather-in-law had been carrying them for a very long time, and he had just decided I was worth spending them on. I had no idea yet how far back they went, or how close they still were to happening again. I'd been a paralegal at Farron & Ostrowski, a 6-attorney estate and trust firm, for 4 years by the time Julian Whitfield proposed to me in the produce section of a grocery store, down on one knee next to the clementines, because he said he couldn't wait until we got home. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I was 29. My mother died when I was 11, and I spent the years after that being shuffled between an aunt in Ohio, a great uncle who fell asleep at every family dinner by 8 o'clock, and eventually a cousin's couch until I was old enough to sign my own lease. So when people ask what drew me to Julian, the honest answer isn't romance, at least not first. It's that his family sat down to dinner every single Sunday at 6, no exceptions, and nobody ever had to ask twice. Diane made that harder than it should have been. She wasn't cruel in front of Julian. She was careful, precise, the kind of cutting that left no fingerprints. She corrected the way I held a wine glass. She asked twice whether I'd always worked in a law office or whether I had other plans eventually, like paralegal was a waiting room instead of a career. At our engagement dinner, she'd raised a glass to new additions who grow into the family given time, and smiled at me the whole way through it. Julian never seemed to catch any of it. His father, Preston, mostly refilled his own glass and let his wife run the room, the way I got the sense he always had for as long as anyone could remember. Walton was different, and I noticed it early. Julian's grandfather was 80, thin as a coat rack, quiet at every gathering in a way that had nothing to do with age. He watched, not the room in general, Diane, specifically. I caught him doing it at Thanksgiving, his eyes tracking her across the kitchen while she told a story about a foundation gala, and whatever was on his face wasn't pride. It was closer to a man checking a lock he didn't fully trust. I mentioned it to Julian once, half joking, lying in bed with the neighbor's dog barking 3 yards over the way it did every night around 11. He said his grandfather had always been like that with her, and rolled over, and I let it go. The way I'd let go of a dozen small strange things about this family already, because I wanted so badly for it to be simple. There was a chipped blue mug Diane always handed me for coffee at their house. Never the good china, always that one, sitting on a shelf like it had been waiting for me specifically. I hadn't learned yet how to read it. Diane didn't answer her phone that night or the next morning. Preston told Julian she'd gone to stay with her sister for a few days to clear her head, which even Preston seemed to know was thin, judging by how fast he said it and how hard he avoided my eyes doing it. I told myself it was nothing, an old woman embarrassed at her own toast, overreacting to a strange comment from an old man. People have breakdowns at rehearsal dinners. It happens. Julian didn't believe that story either. 2 days before the wedding, he drove to his grandfather's condo alone and came back an hour later, quieter than I'd ever seen him. I asked what Walton said. He said his grandfather had told him, almost word for word, that he used to investigate people like her, and then wouldn't say anything else. Not her name, not what kind of people, not why. Julian's hands were still on the steering wheel when he told me this, even though the car had been parked for 10 minutes and the engine was off, like he needed something to hold on to that wasn't me. He said it wasn't his story to finish, Julian told me. He said if I wanted the rest of it, I had to ask my mother, and if she wouldn't tell me, that was information too. I felt my stomach drop somewhere around the word investigate, the specific lurch you get when a sentence lands before your brain finishes translating it. Walton wasn't retired from teaching or insurance, the way I'd always half assumed from the little Julian mentioned about him. He'd worked for the state, 31 years with the Department of Consumer Affairs, the last 12 running its elder fraud unit, a fact Julian delivered like a footnote, and I heard like a gunshot. A man who spent 3 decades building fraud cases against strangers did not stand up at a rehearsal dinner and say 3 words to his own daughter-in-law by accident. He'd been sitting on those words, maybe for years. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Julian listening to him breathe, running 9 elderly investors over and over in my head, and by 4 in the morning I'd made a decision I wasn't proud of and wasn't going to unmake either. I was going to find out what those 3 words meant, whether or not anyone in this family wanted me to. I did what I do for a living, which is dig through records for people who can't or won't do it themselves. At work the next morning, I told Odette Varon, my supervising attorney, 22 years running probate and trust litigation, a woman who could smell a forged signature from across a conference room, that I needed to run a personal search on the county court archive over lunch. She waved me toward the terminal without asking why, the way she did whenever I looked like I hadn't slept. I started with the only two anchors I had, Diane Marsh, a name Walton had let slip once to Julian weeks earlier. In a moment of frustration, neither of us had thought much about at the time, and the state's Consumer Fraud Archive, since that had been Walton's old beat. It took 40 minutes. Then it took my breath away. Case number CV 94-1187, State Department of Consumer Affairs versus Diane Marsh, filed in 1994, a consent order. 9 named investors, all of them over the age of 65 at the time of filing. All of them clients of a company called Cornerstone Retirement Advisory, which Diane Marsh had co-owned and run out of a strip mall office 2 towns over from where the Whitfields live now. The order required $340,000 in restitution, paid out over 8 years, plus a permanent bar from holding any financial advisory license in the state. No criminal charges. The order noted the matter had been resolved civilly, which explained why there was no arrest record for anyone Googling the name Diane Whitfield to ever stumble across. Diane Marsh had married Preston Whitfield in 1997, 3 years after the consent order settled, and had apparently spent every year since building over that name so completely that not even her own son knew it had ever existed. Julian had described his mother more than once as someone who'd always cared about elderly people. She'd founded the Whitfield Elder Trust Foundation the year Julian turned 12, chaired 3 galas a year, had her photo in the regional paper next to sentences like tireless advocate for the county's senior community. I sat at that terminal with my hands not quite steady, the printer humming somewhere behind me, and read that sentence 3 times, because I understood in a way that made my throat go tight exactly what kind of woman builds a 30-year monument directly on top of the thing she's hiding. I printed the consent order. I didn't tell Julian that night. I told myself I needed to be sure first, which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I didn't yet know what I was going to do with what I'd found, and some part of me wasn't ready to find out. I didn't have to tell anyone else either. Word traveled on its own. Half the rehearsal dinner had been foundation donors or board acquaintances of Diane's, and by the following week I heard, secondhand through Julian's cousin, that at least 2 guests had recognized the shape of the story even without the specifics. An old scandal, something about an alias, something from before Diane became Diane Whitfield. Nobody had proof. They had a woman sprinting out of a private dining room at the sound of 3 words, and in a social circle like that one, that was already enough. One of the foundation's longtime donors, a retired dentist named Foster Ambrose who'd sat 2 tables over at the dinner, called Julian's cousin directly to ask, carefully, whether the Marsh situation had ever actually been resolved, a phrase that meant nothing to any of us, and apparently a great deal to a certain generation of people who'd once read the regional paper's business section closely. Another guest quietly withdrew a pledge she'd made at the foundation's spring gala, citing an abundance of caution, which was the kind of sentence that told you everything and admitted to nothing. None of it was proof. All of it was momentum, and momentum, I was starting to understand, was the one thing 30 years of careful reputation building couldn't fully insulate against. The Whitfield Elder Trust Foundation's board scheduled an emergency session for the following Thursday. Julian found out because his mother finally surfaced, 4 days after the dinner, pale, thinner, refusing to explain anything beyond calling the whole incident an old man's confusion, and mentioned the meeting like a scheduling note, not the first crack in 30 years of careful construction. I sat across from her at Sunday dinner, the first one since the rehearsal, and watched her ladle soup into bowls with hands that didn't shake, and I thought about the chipped blue mug, and I thought about 9 names on a consent order, and I said nothing. Preston barely spoke through dinner. He kept refilling glasses that didn't need refilling. And Walton ate quietly at the end of the table like a man who had already said everything he intended to say, and was waiting, patiently, to see what the rest of us would do with it. When Diane excused herself to get more bread, he caught my eye across the table for exactly 1 second. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. I understood, sitting there with a spoon halfway to my mouth, that he already knew I'd found it. The case number, the name, all of it. The same way he'd known everything else about her for 30 years. He'd been waiting to see if I'd have the nerve to look. She caught me alone 4 days later, in the kitchen of the house Julian and I were about to move into together, 3 days before the wedding. I hadn't heard her key in the lock. Julian had given her one for emergencies before I'd moved in, a fact I was only now understanding the full weight of, and I turned from the sink to find her standing in the doorway in a cream coat, holding a wedding gift bag like a prop. "You've been busy," she said. Not a question. I didn't deny it. My hands had gone cold around the dish towel I was holding, but I made myself set it down slowly, the way you'd set down anything you didn't want to look like you were bracing with. "I found the consent order," I said. "Case number CV 94-1187, 9 investors, $340,000. Something moved behind her face. Not shame, I realized, watching closely. Calculation. "That was 30 years ago," she said, setting the gift bag on the counter like she was choosing where to place a chess piece. "I was a different person. I've spent 3 decades making it right. The foundation, the donors, every gala, every dollar. Do you have any idea how much good that money has done? How many families I've helped since?" Her voice stayed level, almost gentle, the tone she used at galas, and that was somehow worse than yelling would have been. You dig this up 3 days before my son's wedding, and what does it accomplish? You embarrass this family. You embarrass Julian, and you should ask yourself very seriously whether this family still wants you in it once the dust settles. I felt my pulse in my throat, that specific pressure of it, and I made myself keep my voice as flat as hers. I'm not trying to embarrass anyone, I said. I'm trying to understand why Walton's been watching you like that for 30 years. That's not something a person does over a mistake somebody already paid for. Diane's jaw tightened. One small motion, gone almost as fast as it came. Walton doesn't know everything he thinks he knows, she said, and picked the gift bag back up, straightening it against her hip like nothing had happened at all. At the door, she turned around one more time. You grew up with nothing, Raina. I understand the appeal of a family like this one. I'd think very hard before I did anything that cost you your place in it. Then she was gone, and I stood alone in a kitchen that wasn't fully mine yet, my hands finally shaking the way they should have been shaking through the entire conversation. She didn't deny it once, I thought. Not the case, not the name. She only ever defended the 30 years after it. I should have stopped there. I told myself I would for about a day. Then Odette asked me, entirely unrelated to any of this, to help pull comparison filings for a client's due diligence review of a regional nonprofit board, routine work, nothing to do with Diane. And while I had the state charity registry open anyway, I typed in Whitfield Elder Trust Foundation before I could talk myself out of it. 5 years of public 990 filings. I almost didn't see it the first time through. Foundation accounting is deliberately boring, built to be skimmed. But on the third pass, a line item caught on something in my memory and wouldn't let go. Advisory fee, estate consulting, paid 3 times over 5 years, each time between $11,000 and $18,000, each time to Diane Whitfield personally, each time drawn from a specific donor's estate gift rather than the foundation's general operating fund. I cross-referenced the 3 donor names against the foundation's own newsletter archive, the one that ran small tribute photos of beloved supporters who'd passed and left the foundation something in their wills. Eleanor Voss, 84, a former school teacher. Harold Bisset, 81, a widower with no children. Corinne Delgado, 79, who according to her tribute photo had baked for every gala for a decade. 3 elderly donors, 3 advisory fees. No paperwork anywhere describing what advice had actually been given, or why a foundation chair would be personally compensated in cash out of a specific bequest for work that should have gone through the foundation's own accountants. It was smaller than Cornerstone Retirement Advisory. It was legal, or close enough to legal that no prosecutor would look twice without a reason to go looking, but it was the same shape. Find someone old and trusting. Make yourself useful and irreplaceable. Take a fee nobody thinks to question, from an account nobody else is watching closely enough. Diane hadn't stopped in 1994. She'd gotten smaller and better dressed, and patient enough to let 3 decades pass between meals. I sat at my desk that evening after everyone else had gone home, the office quiet except for the hum of the ancient radiator under the window, and I thought about calling Julian first. I didn't. I thought about calling Walton. I didn't do that either. What I did was print all 3 filings, staple them to the consent order I already had, and sit with the stack of paper in my lap for a long time, feeling the particular kind of sick that comes from being right about something you desperately wished you weren't. 2 days before the wedding, I had 2 days to decide whether I was going to hand a stack of paper to someone who could actually do something with it, or whether I was going to let this family's 30-year-old silence stand. Walton's silence, Preston's silence, everyone's silence, as the only consequence Diane Whitfield would ever face. I did the only thing that made sense for someone who spends her days inside a law office. I stopped trying to solve this alone and asked for help from someone whose entire career was built on exactly this kind of paper trail. Odette listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which for Odette was its own kind of alarming. And when I finished, she picked up the consent order, read the case number twice, and said, "This isn't ours to prosecute, but it's absolutely something the foundation's own governance obligates them to investigate. And if what you found in those filings is what it looks like, the state's Consumer Protection Division is going to want it too." She made 2 calls before I left her office that evening. The first went to Priya Kestenbaum, a forensic accountant and certified fraud examiner who'd done independent audit work for 2 other nonprofits Odette's firm had represented. 14 years in the field, Odette said, the kind of auditor whose findings held up when boards tried to argue them away. The second, made with my permission, went to a name I hadn't expected to hear again so soon. Colum Fassett, an assistant attorney general in the very Consumer Protection Division Walton had once run, close enough in tenure that he recognized Walton's name on site the moment Odette mentioned who'd first raised the alarm. Priya reviewed the filings inside 48 hours and confirmed what I'd already suspected in my gut. The 3 advisory fees didn't match any documented consulting work on file anywhere in the foundation's records, and the amounts, taken together, sat suspiciously close to what an estate attorney would flag as a self-dealing pattern, a fiduciary quietly steering a portion of donated funds back to herself, small enough each time to avoid triggering an audit, frequent enough over 5 years to add up. "It's not the same crime as 1994, Priya told me over the phone, her voice clipped and precise in the way of someone who'd said sentences like this hundreds of times before. "It's the same instinct wearing better clothes." Colum Fassett's office opened opened what he called a preliminary inquiry, not charges, not yet, just the quiet first motion of an investigation that could, depending on what surfaced, grow into something much larger. He asked me to preserve everything I had. He asked, gently, whether I understood that once his office was formally involved, this stopped being a family matter I could take back. Priya asked me to walk her through the filings line by line over a video call 2 days later, her camera angled at a desk stacked with binders, a whiteboard behind her covered in numbers that meant nothing to me until she started drawing arrows between them. She wanted to know exactly when each advisory fee had posted relative to each donor's date of death, exactly which board members had signed off on the disbursements, and whether any of the 3 families had ever received an itemized explanation of what the fee was for. The answer every time was no. She said that gap, the total absence of a paper trail explaining services rendered, was usually the difference between a defensible fee and a finding of breach of fiduciary duty, and that in her professional opinion, drawn from 14 years of exactly this kind of work, this wasn't close. Colum Facet's office, for its part, moved with the specific unhurried patience of people who had learned the hard way that rushing a white-collar case only handed the defense an appeal issue later. He explained the preliminary inquiry would stay quiet for now. No press release, no public docket entry, while his office decided whether the pattern justified escalating beyond a civil referral. I told him I understood. I wasn't sure at the time that I actually did. The call came at 9:40 the night before the wedding, while I was standing in my dress for the final fitting, pins still in the hem, my phone buzzing against the bathroom counter where I'd left it. Colum Facet's office needed my authorization, as the original source who'd provided the documents, to formally request bank records from the foundation's financial institution, a step that would, within days, become discoverable to the foundation's full board and very possibly the press. He said if I wanted, they could hold the request until after the weekend. He also said carefully that in his experience, giving people like Diane Whitfield extra days to prepare rarely worked out well for anyone trying to hold them accountable. I had until morning, 14 hours. I sat on that bathroom floor doing the math nobody wants to do the night before their wedding. 14 hours until Column's deadline, 9 hours until the hair appointment, 6 until the photographer wanted us at the venue. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and not from the cold tile. Julian found me sitting on the bathroom floor in my dress, pins and all, holding my phone in both hands like it might go off. I told him everything, finally, all of it. The consent order, the 3 names, Eleanor Voss and Harold Bisset and Corinne Delgado, the advisory fees, Priya, Colum, the 14 hours. I watched my fiancé's face go through something I never wanted to watch anyone's face go through twice. He didn't ask if I was sure. He asked in a voice gone completely flat whether his grandfather had known this the whole time and let him grow up thinking his mother was simply a good person who did good things. I think he was protecting your father's marriage, I said, not her. I think he decided a long time ago that the debt he owed his son was bigger than the one he owed the truth. I think today, watching her at that table, he decided the debt was paid. Julian didn't say anything for a long time. Then he asked me the question I'd been asking myself since 9:40. Did I want to be married tomorrow with this hanging over both of us unresolved, or did I want it settled first? Whatever settled turned out to mean, even if that meant the wedding itself became the place it detonated. I thought about growing up on other people's couches, about learning young that families could look solid and still be built on something nobody would admit to. I thought about the chipped blue mug. I thought about Walton, sitting quietly at the end of every table for 30 years, waiting to see if anyone besides him would ever have the nerve to look. At 6:15 in the morning, still in yesterday's clothes, I called Colum Facet's office and told them to proceed. The subpoena request went out at 8. By 11, someone on the foundation's own board, Beatrice Linden, the vice chair, a woman who'd sat on that board for 11 years and had apparently been quietly uneasy about Diane's bookkeeping for longer than any of us knew, had gotten wind of the inquiry through a contact in the AG's office and called an emergency session of her own, 3 hours before my wedding was scheduled to start. Diane did not answer that call. She did, however, show up to the ceremony. She sat in the second row in pale blue, composed, jaw set, and if you didn't know what she was carrying, you'd have thought she was simply a mother watching her son get married. I stood at the altar in a dress with pins still faintly marking the hem where I'd sat on a bathroom floor 12 hours earlier, and I watched Walton walk Julian down the short aisle beside his father, steady on a cane he mostly didn't need, and I understood that this ceremony was happening inside 2 entirely different stories at once, the one everyone else could see, and the one that was about to catch up to all of us regardless of what day it was. It caught up to us at the reception, during toasts, which felt less like irony and more like a debt collecting itself. Preston stood first, hands shaking slightly around a note card he never once looked at, and instead of the toast he'd clearly prepared. He said that his father had told him everything that morning, the consent order, the case number, the 9 names Walton had carried silently for 3 decades, because he'd believed, wrongly, that protecting his son's marriage meant protecting his son from the truth about who he'd married. Preston's voice cracked once, on the word protecting. He said he understood now why his father had watched his wife the way he had for 30 years. He said he was sorry it had taken his son's wedding day to finally ask. Then Walton stood, slower this time, both hands braced on the table, and the room went as quiet as it had at the rehearsal dinner 3 days earlier. Quieter, maybe, because because this time everyone already half suspected what was coming. I investigated elder fraud for 31 years, he said. I found Diane Marsh in 1994 because 9 people trusted her with what little they had left, and she took it. I watched her marry my son 3 years later under a different name, and God forgive me, I let it stand. Because Preston was happy, and because I told myself a debt paid was a debt paid. I was wrong. It was never paid. It just got smaller and quieter, and it started again with 3 more names I only found, because Raina had the nerve to look where I'd stopped looking. He turned then and looked directly at Diane for the second time in 3 days. Eleanor Voss, Harold Bisset, Corinne Delgado, 9 elderly investors, he said, became 3 elderly donors. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern, and I'm done being the only person who's known it. Diane didn't run this time. She sat very still, hands folded in her lap, and I watched something in her finally give way. Not tears, not yet, just the visible collapse of 30 years of careful architecture happening in real time in front of 200 wedding guests. 2 weeks later, the Whitfield Elder Trust Foundation's board voted 7-1 to remove her as chair, following Priya Kestenbaum's completed forensic review and a formal finding of undisclosed self-dealing. Diane repaid the advisory fees in full within the month. To avoid further proceedings, her lawyer's statement said, careful, bloodless language that didn't come close to covering it. Colum Fassett's office kept its file open a while longer, weighing whether the newer conduct, smaller and more carefully wrapped in legitimate-looking paperwork than the 1994 scheme, cleared the bar for a criminal referral, or whether, like the consent order 30 years before it, it would resolve as one more civil settlement that let her walk away with her name, if not her standing, intact. It wasn't the ending anyone would have chosen for a wedding day. Julian and I talked about that a lot in the weeks after. Whether I should have waited, whether some things are worth blowing up a family's one good day to expose. I don't know that there's a clean answer to that. What I know is that Eleanor Voss's daughter called the foundation's new interim chair 2 days after the board vote, crying, to ask whether her mother's estate gift, the one advisory fee skimmed off it, could finally be redirected the way Eleanor had actually intended it. It could. It was. That phone call is the part of this I still think about most, more than the vote, more than the toast. The fact that somewhere, an 84-year-old former school teacher's actual wishes finally got honored, 4 years after she died and 30 years after Diane Marsh first learned exactly how to make that not happen. Diane came to the first Sunday dinner after the board's vote. Nobody suggested she shouldn't, and nobody quite explained why she still had a key to the house Julian and I now shared. But she came, and she sat at the far end of the table where Walton used to sit, and Walton sat where she used to. Nobody said anything about the seating. Nobody had to. Preston passed the bread around. Julian reached for my hand under the table, the way he did more often now, since the wedding. And Diane, chair no longer, patient no longer waiting to be caught, looked down the length of the table at the 2 of us, and for 1 second, something in her face flickered toward the woman who'd raised a glass in the Ashgrove room and called me a girl who might lower the family's standards. She didn't say it again. She didn't have to. Diane Whitfield had spent 30 years terrified that someone would lower this family's standards. It turned out she was the only one who ever had.